May 17, 1967. Con Tum Province, South Vietnam. 04:30 hours. Staff Sergeant Billy Waugh pressed his body flat against the wet jungle floor, his CAR-15 tucked tight against his ribs. 15 meters away, through the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear them. North Vietnamese Army soldiers, dozens of them, moving south along the trail his 6-man reconnaissance team had been watching for 3 days. The radio operator behind him breathed so quietly, Waugh had to glance back to confirm he was still conscious. This was what Project Delta did, what no one else would do, what most people didn't even know could be done. They'd been inserted 4 days earlier, dropped by helicopter into a small clearing 8 kilometers inside Cambodia, officially neutral territory where American ground forces weren't supposed to operate. Their mission: locate and map NVA base camps, feeding troops into South Vietnam's Central Highlands. No close air support. No artillery within range. No quick reaction force if things went sideways. Just 6 Americans and 6 Montagnard scouts, surrounded by an estimated 5,000 enemy soldiers who would torture them to death if captured. The NVA column passed within spitting distance. Waugh counted 47 soldiers, 3 ox carts loaded with supplies, and what looked like 2 Chinese advisors. He photographed them with a silent camera, marked the coordinates, and waited. When the last soldier disappeared into the jungle, Waugh's team melted deeper into the vegetation. In 3 hours, they'd call in an airstrike that would destroy that entire supply convoy before it crossed the border. No one would ever know Project Delta had been there. That was exactly the point. The enemy called them phantoms. American conventional commanders called them cowboys and prima donnas. But the men of Project Delta had a different name for what they did. They called it going hunting where the bears live. And for 5 years, from 1964 to 1969, they hunted like no one else in Vietnam. When Major Charlie Beckwith first pitched the concept for Project Delta in late 1963, his superiors at MACV thought he'd lost his mind. You want to take 12-man teams and drop them how deep into enemy territory? Colonel George Morton had asked, leaning back in his chair at the Special Warfare Center. With no artillery support, for a week? Beckwith, fresh from a tour with the British SAS in Malaya, didn't blink. Sir, the British did it for years against communist insurgents. Small teams, long-range reconnaissance, indigenous troops. They called it jungle craft. We need to know where Charlie's base camps are, where he's moving, what he's planning. You can't get that information from battalion-sized sweeps. The initial reception was skeptical at best. Traditional military thinking in 1964 still favored conventional operations, large unit maneuvers, set-piece battles, overwhelming firepower. The idea of sending tiny teams to operate independently for extended periods, beyond the range of supporting arms, struck many commanders as reckless. Special forces playing Rambo, as one infantry colonel dismissed it. But a handful of forward-thinking officers saw the potential. Colonel Theodore Leonard, commanding 5th Special Forces Group, understood that Vietnam required a different approach. We're fighting an enemy who knows the terrain, who chooses when to fight and when to disappear, Leonard argued in a January 1964 briefing. We need eyes where the enemy thinks he's safe. We need to make him afraid in his own backyard. The strategic logic was sound. By late 1963, it had become clear that Viet Cong and NVA units were using sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos to rest, refit, and plan operations. They'd strike across the border, inflict casualties, then disappear back into neutral territory, where American forces couldn't officially follow. Conventional intelligence, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, agent reports, provided only fragments of the puzzle. Project Delta proposed something radical. Put American eyes directly on the enemy's supply routes, base camps, and staging areas. Gather real-time intelligence. Call in airstrikes on targets no one else could find. Create psychological pressure by making the enemy feel hunted even in his safest areas. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity, recalled Colonel Robert Kingston, who later commanded MACV SOG. Small teams could see without being seen. They could gather intelligence that entire divisions couldn't obtain. And because they were small, they could operate in areas where large units would be massacred. Initial funding came through in March 1964. The unit was designated Detachment B-52, Project Delta, 5th Special Forces Group. Major Beckwith handpicked his men from volunteers across Special Forces, soldiers who'd already proven themselves in unconventional warfare, who could operate independently, who wouldn't panic when things went wrong. Because in reconnaissance operations deep behind enemy lines, things always went wrong. The selection process was brutal. Beckwith wanted guys who could think on their feet, said Master Sergeant Robert Howard, who would become Project Delta's most decorated member. Not just shoot straight, but make decisions when you're alone in the jungle with 50 NVA hunting for you. Physical standards were extreme. Mental toughness was paramount. Cultural sensitivity mattered. These Americans would work closely with Montagnard tribesmen and Vietnamese rangers, and perhaps most important, psychological stability under crushing stress. You had to function when you were exhausted, soaking wet, hungry, and listening to the enemy searching for you 5 meters away, Howard explained. Not everyone can do that. By summer 1964, Project Delta was operational. Few outside Special Forces even knew it existed. Conventional commanders viewed it as an expensive experiment. Beckwith's private army, as some dismissively called it. They'd give it 6 months, maybe a year. After all, how much difference could a few dozen men really make? They were about to find out. Project Delta's origin story begins not in Vietnam, but in the Malayan emergency of the 1950s, where British SAS squadrons pioneered deep penetration reconnaissance against communist guerrillas. Major Charlie Beckwith had studied under the SAS during a 1962-63 exchange program, learning techniques that seemed impossible by American military standards. The British would insert 4-man teams by helicopter into primary jungle. No radio contact for days, living on cold rations, tracking guerrillas through swamps. Beckwith wrote in his after-action reports. They'd spend a week gathering intelligence, then call in strikes or guide larger units to the target. It was the most effective counterinsurgency method I'd ever seen. When Beckwith returned to Fort Bragg in late 1963, he found an army struggling to adapt to Vietnam's unique challenges. President Kennedy's focus on counterinsurgency and special forces had created organizational momentum, but tactical doctrine remained rooted in conventional warfare. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, under General Paul Harkins, emphasized advise and support missions with South Vietnamese forces. Nobody was thinking about Americans conducting independent reconnaissance deep in enemy-controlled territory. Beckwith changed that. Working with Lieutenant Colonel Don Blackburn, who'd run guerrilla operations in the Philippines during World War II, Beckwith drafted the operational concept for what would become Project Delta. The proposal arrived on desks at MACV headquarters in January 1964. The core concept was elegant. Create small, highly trained reconnaissance teams that could operate 5,100 kilometers beyond friendly lines for 5 to 7 days at a time. These teams, called Roadrunner teams initially, later standardized as Recondo teams, would locate enemy bases, map infiltration routes, identify targets for B-52 strikes, and provide real-time intelligence that conventional sources couldn't match. Organizationally, Project Delta would be built around 3 components. First, the reconnaissance teams themselves. Each team had 12 members, 2 American Special Forces soldiers and 10 indigenous troops, usually Montagnards from Vietnam's Central Highlands or experienced Vietnamese Rangers. The Americans provided technical expertise, communications, and airstrike coordination. The indigenous soldiers provided local knowledge, language skills, and cultural understanding crucial for operating in remote areas. Second, a reaction force of 600-900 airborne qualified Vietnamese Rangers who could reinforce reconnaissance teams in trouble or exploit intelligence by conducting raids on discovered enemy positions. This was innovation itself. Previous reconnaissance concepts had no organic quick reaction capability. Third, a dedicated aviation detachment with helicopters and light aircraft for insertion, extraction, resupply, and close air support. This solved one of reconnaissance's fundamental problems: getting teams in and out without compromising their locations. Major Beckwith officially assumed command of Detachment B-52 on May 15, 1964, at Nha Trang. His first challenge was recruitment. He needed a specific type of soldier, not just physically tough, but mentally resilient, tactically creative, and comfortable working with indigenous forces. "We didn't want the typical gung-ho commando type," explained Captain Larry Thorne, née Laurie Turney, one of Delta's first team leaders. "We wanted soldiers who could think, who understood that reconnaissance isn't about fighting, it's about seeing without being seen." Training began in June 1964 at Camp Goodman near Nha Trang. The curriculum drew heavily on British SAS methods, but adapted them for Vietnam's unique environment. Soldiers learned jungle navigation using only map, compass, and natural landmarks, tracking both game and human movement through dense vegetation, silent movement techniques that allowed teams to pass within meters of enemy positions undetected, communication protocols using one-time pads and brevity codes, photography and intelligence reporting under field conditions, survival skills for living in the jungle without resupply, close quarters battle tactics for when stealth failed, helicopter insertion and extraction procedures, including emergency methods. "The training was harder than any combat I'd experienced," recalled Sergeant First Class Jerry Mad Dog Shriver, who joined Project Delta in 1965. "Beckwith would drop us in the jungle for a week with minimal food and water. We'd have to navigate to checkpoints, photograph targets, avoid enemy patrols, and extract on schedule. If you got captured, you failed." The first operational missions launched in August 1964. Initial insertions targeted the Central Highlands, areas where intelligence indicated NVA infiltration, but conventional forces had limited presence. The results exceeded expectations. On August 23, 1964, a Project Delta team operating west of Pleiku discovered a previously unknown NVA base camp, housing an estimated 500 soldiers. The team observed for 3 days, photographed the camp's layout, counted personnel and equipment, then directed a B-52 strike that destroyed the facility. Total American casualties: none. Enemy casualties: unknown but substantial. "That mission proved the concept," said Colonel Leonard. "One 12-man team had accomplished what an infantry battalion couldn't have done without taking heavy casualties." But success brought new challenges. As more teams deployed, enemy counter-reconnaissance improved. The NVA began hunting the hunters. On September 12, 1964, a Project Delta team commanded by Captain Jim Butler was compromised near the Cambodian border. What followed was a running firefight that lasted 18 hours before helicopters could extract the survivors. Butler and 4 Montagnards were killed. 3 Americans and 2 indigenous soldiers escaped with wounds. The Butler incident forced tactical refinements. Teams began moving primarily at night. Communications windows became shorter and more irregular. Insertion and extraction techniques evolved. False insertions, multiple landing zones, and deceptive flight patterns designed to confuse enemy trackers became standard. By late 1964, Project Delta had established operational patterns that would define its effectiveness for the next 5 years. Teams rotated through 3-week cycles. 1 week of mission preparation and briefing, 1 week in the field conducting reconnaissance, 1 week of debriefing and rest. The tempo was relentless. The stress was extraordinary. The results were undeniable. "We were seeing things no one else saw," explained Sergeant Major Billy Waugh. "We'd watch NVA colonels walking around base camps. We'd see Chinese advisors training VC units. We'd observe supply caches being built up for offensives. And we'd call in the bombs that turned those camps into craters." By December 1964, Project Delta had conducted 43 reconnaissance missions, located 17 major enemy base camps, and directed 89 tactical airstrikes against targets that conventional intelligence had never detected. American casualties: 9 killed, 14 wounded. Enemy casualties estimated at over 800 killed, countless facilities destroyed. The skeptics at MACV headquarters were becoming believers. The expensive experiment was proving its worth, but the real test was still to come. February 8, 1966. Giak To, Kon Province. The mission brief was straightforward. Insert a reconnaissance team 15 kilometers west of the Special Forces camp at Giak To. Locate suspected NVA infiltration routes. Observe for 5 days. Extract. Standard Project Delta operation. What happened instead would change how the U.S. military understood the war. Staff Sergeant Charles Hosking's team, codenamed Sidewinder, inserted at dawn on February 8th. By 1300 hours, they'd found something impossible. A fully developed road, wide enough for trucks, carved through jungle so thick it was invisible from the air. Hosking called it in. Headquarters was skeptical. Roads that size didn't exist in that area. Intelligence said so. Hosking spent the next 3 days proving intelligence wrong. His team paralleled the road, photographing, measuring, documenting. They watched NVA trucks hauling supplies south. They observed work parties maintaining and widening the road. They discovered camouflaged way stations every few kilometers. "We'd found a highway," Hosking reported. "Not a trail. A goddamn highway running from Cambodia straight toward our positions." On February 11th, Hosking's team called in an airstrike on a convoy of 6 trucks. The F-4 Phantoms destroyed the vehicles and triggered a secondary explosion that suggested ammunition cargo. But the strike also alerted the NVA to the reconnaissance team's presence. What followed was 36 hours of nightmare. NVA trackers, experienced at hunting Project Delta teams, picked up Sidewinder's trail. Hosking's 12-man team found themselves pursued by an estimated 200 enemy soldiers. They moved at night, crossing streams to break their scent trail, using every evasion technique they knew. "I could hear them behind us, calling to each other, coordinating the search," recalled team member Sergeant Robert Graham. They weren't random patrols. They were trained hunters who knew exactly what they were doing. On February 12th, surrounded and low on ammunition, Hosking called for emergency extraction. Helicopters fought through heavy ground fire to pull the team out. All 12 men survived, but 4 were wounded, and the team's Vietnamese interpreter later died from his injuries. But Hosking brought back something invaluable. Proof that the NVA was building a sophisticated logistics infrastructure far more advanced than anyone at MACV had imagined. The road he discovered was part of what would later be recognized as an expanded Ho Chi Minh Trail system, a network eventually including 12,000 miles of roads and trails. The intelligence from Hosking's mission triggered a series of larger reconnaissance operations throughout 1966 and early 1967. Project Delta teams discovered a 600-bed underground hospital complex near the Cambodian border, discovered March 1966. Multiple regimental-sized base camps in supposedly unoccupied areas. Communication wire running for kilometers along infiltration routes. Training camps where NVA soldiers were being prepared for operations in South Vietnam cities, May 21, 1967. Operation Blackjack 21, Bin Long Province. If the Hosking mission revealed the scope of enemy infrastructure, Operation Blackjack 21 demonstrated Project Delta's ability to exploit such intelligence at scale. Based on reconnaissance reports from 3 Project Delta teams, planners identified a major NVA base complex near the village of Loc Ninh, just south of the Cambodian border. Rather than conventional assault, they designed an operation around Project Delta's capabilities. 6 reconnaissance teams inserted simultaneously across a 20-kilometer front. For 4 days, they observed, photographed, and mapped enemy positions. Their intelligence revealed not one base camp, but an interconnected complex housing parts of 3 NVA regiments, approximately 2,500 soldiers. On May 25th, with Project Delta teams providing real-time targeting data, B-52 bombers struck the complex in what was then the largest arc-light mission in the war. 36 bombers dropped 180 tons of bombs. Project Delta teams, hidden in observation posts, watched the devastation and called in battle damage assessments. It was like watching the Earth explode, said Sergeant First Class Robert Howard, whose team was 800 meters from the impact zone. The jungle just disappeared. Everything was fire and smoke. For 2 days afterward, we could hear secondary explosions as ammunition caches cooked off. Enemy casualties were estimated at 400 to 600 killed, with the base complex rendered unusable. American casualties, 0. But Operation Blackjack 21 also revealed a troubling pattern. Post-strike reconnaissance showed the NVA had rebuilt a functioning base camp within 3 weeks. They'd adapted to American tactics, dispersing facilities, hardening bunkers, creating multiple positions they could abandon and reoccupy as needed. We could destroy their camps, but we couldn't destroy their will, observed Major Charles Beckwith. Every time we hit them, they'd rebuild somewhere else. It was like fighting water. You could punch it, but it just flowed around your fist. September 1967. January 1968, the Tet preparation period. Throughout late 1967, Project Delta teams began reporting anomalies. Increased enemy movement, stockpiling of supplies near cities, unusual radio traffic, sightings of NVA officers conducting reconnaissance of urban areas. On November 14, 1967, a team commanded by Captain Larry White photographed what appeared to be an NVA colonel and staff officers surveying Kontum City from a ridge line. They were pointing at buildings, taking notes, acting like they were planning something, White reported. But nobody was taking it seriously. Intelligence kept saying the enemy couldn't mass forces near cities without detection. On January 12, 1968, another team discovered ammunition and weapons caches hidden near Nha Trang, a coastal city thought secure from major attack. The team's report noted quantities of ammunition and weapons inconsistent with local VC activities, suggests preparation for conventional assault. MACV intelligence officers dismissed the reports. The prevailing view was that the enemy was massing for attacks in remote areas, places like Khe Sanh. Nobody believed the enemy could or would attack urban areas simultaneously across South Vietnam. Project Delta kept reporting what it saw. The intelligence summaries from December 1967 and January 1968 read in retrospect like a preview of the Tet offensive. But the organizational bias toward conventional threat assessment meant the warnings were ignored or misinterpreted. When the Tet offensive exploded on January 30-31, 1968, attacking over 100 cities simultaneously, Project Delta personnel felt vindication and frustration in equal measure. "We told them," Sergeant Major Billy Waugh said later. "We'd been telling them for months, but nobody wanted to hear that the enemy was capable of something that bold." The Tet Offensive wasn't a Project Delta failure. Their intelligence had been accurate, but it exposed the limits of tactical intelligence when strategic-level decision-makers refused to believe what the tactical evidence revealed. For Project Delta, Tet marked a turning point. They'd proven they could find and track the enemy. But could anyone use that intelligence effectively? The answer would define the final 2 years of Project Delta's existence. By mid-1968, both Project Delta and their NVA adversaries had evolved into something far more sophisticated than anyone imagined in 1964. Project Delta's tactical refinements. The most significant change was the development of Roadrunner operations, a technique so dangerous that volunteers were required. Roadrunner teams consisted of 2 to 4 men disguised as NVA or Viet Cong soldiers, wearing enemy uniforms, carrying enemy weapons, and moving through enemy-controlled territory in broad daylight. It was psychological warfare taken to the extreme, explained Sergeant First Class Jerry Shriver, who ran more Roadrunner missions than anyone else. "We'd walk right past enemy soldiers. They'd see us and we'd nod, and they'd nod back. As long as we looked like we belonged, their brains didn't register the threat." The technique was brilliant and terrifying. Roadrunner teams could observe enemy positions from inside, photograph documents, even sit in on planning meetings if they spoke Vietnamese. But if compromised, they faced certain torture and execution as spies. On July 12, 1968, Shriver's 3-man Roadrunner team walked through an NVA base camp of approximately 200 soldiers, photographed supply dumps, noted unit designations, and extracted without firing a shot. "I stood 3 feet from an NVA major," Shriver recalled. "He looked right at me. I saluted. He saluted back. My heart was beating so hard I thought he'd hear it." Project Delta also pioneered the use of miniaturized sensors and tracking devices. Teams would plant small radio transmitters near enemy trails, allowing intelligence officers to track patterns of movement without maintaining constant human surveillance. When sensors detected significant activity, reconnaissance teams could investigate. Communication techniques evolved dramatically. Early teams used standard military radios with scheduled contact windows. By 1968, Delta teams employed burst transmission technology that sent encrypted messages in less than a second, too fast for enemy direction-finding equipment to track. They also developed elaborate brevity codes where a single phrase could convey the complex information. NVA counter-reconnaissance evolution. The North Vietnamese weren't passive victims. By late 1967, they'd developed sophisticated counter-reconnaissance capabilities specifically designed to hunt Project Delta teams. "They had dedicated tracker units," said Master Sergeant Robert Howard. "Not regular infantry, but specialized soldiers trained in hunting American reconnaissance teams. They were good, really good." NVA counter-reconnaissance tactics included false trails and deception, creating dummy base camps while hiding real facilities deeper in the jungle. Project Delta teams would report these decoys, airstrikes would destroy them, and the real camps remained untouched. Quick reaction forces. Positioning rapid response units near suspected reconnaissance insertion areas. When helicopters were spotted, these forces would immediately begin searching likely landing zones. Enhanced security. Posting sentries with radios at multiple distances from base camps. This early warning system gave them time to ambush American teams or evacuate before airstrikes arrived. Tracking dogs. By 1968, NVA units had begun using dogs to hunt reconnaissance teams. "The dogs changed everything," Howard explained. "You couldn't hide your scent trail. You had to move faster, take more risks with stream crossings and rocky terrain where dogs lost the scent. The most sophisticated counter-reconnaissance technique was what Project Delta called honeypots, deliberately exposing what appeared to be valuable targets to lure in reconnaissance teams, then ambushing them. On August 3, 1968, a Project Delta team walked into such a trap near Bu Prang. They'd been tracking what appeared to be a supply convoy when they stumbled into a U-shaped ambush. Only aggressive air support and extraordinary luck got them out. 2 Americans and 5 Montagnards were killed. The psychological dimension. Both sides were fighting a war of nerves. Project Delta teams operated with the constant knowledge that capture meant torture. The NVA weren't bound by Geneva Convention rules when it came to spies, said Sergeant Graham. We knew what happened if they caught us in enemy uniforms, so you had that in your head every second. Conversely, NVA commanders knew that American reconnaissance teams could be anywhere, watching anything. This psychological pressure forced them to expend resources on security, limited their freedom of movement, and created paranoia within their ranks. We'd leave little calling cards sometimes, Jerry Shriver admitted. Nothing that compromised the mission, but things that would let them know we'd been inside their perimeter. A cigarette butt in their command bunker. An American coin on their operations map. Psychological warfare. Technological arms race. By 1968-69, Project Delta had access to technology that seemed like science fiction in 1964. Starlight scopes, night vision devices that allowed observation in near total darkness. Miniaturized cameras that could photograph documents in seconds. Portable motion sensors that could be hidden along trails. Improved radio equipment with longer range and better encryption. Laser designators for guiding precision munitions, late 1969. But technology had limitations. All the fancy gear in the world doesn't help when you're surrounded by 50 NVA and trying not to breathe too loud, observed Sergeant Waugh. At the end of the day, it still came down to fieldcraft, patience, and mental toughness. The cost of evolution. The increasingly sophisticated nature of reconnaissance operations took a psychological toll. Project Delta's rotation system, designed to prevent burnout, struggled to keep pace with operational demands. Men were running missions back-to-back with minimal rest. By 1969, everyone I knew was on his 2nd or 3rd tour, said Captain Larry White. We were exhausted physically and mentally. But we kept going because the mission mattered, and because we trusted each other more than we trusted anyone outside the unit. The casualty rate crept upward. In 1965-66, Project Delta suffered approximately 15% casualties per year. By 1968-69, that figure had climbed to nearly 30%. Not because the teams became less competent, but because the enemy became more dangerous and the missions became more aggressive. March 1969. Operation Atlas Wedge. Tai Ninh Province. Project Delta reached its operational zenith with Operation Atlas Wedge, a series of reconnaissance missions that located and targeted the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, the mobile NVA-VC headquarters controlling communist operations across South Vietnam's southern regions. 8 Project Delta teams deployed simultaneously across a 40-kilometer front in Tai Ninh Province. Their mission: locate COSVN's current position and map the base complex for a massive B-52 strike. For 2 weeks, these teams operated deeper in enemy territory than American forces had ever penetrated. They photographed bunker complexes, identified communication facilities, observed high-ranking officers, and called in precise targeting coordinates. On March 18, 1969, B-52s struck what reconnaissance teams had identified as COSVN headquarters. The strike was devastating, destroying the facility and killing an estimated 150-200 enemy personnel. Intelligence reports suggested several high-ranking officers were among the casualties. It was the most successful target development operation of the entire war, Colonel Robert Kingston assessed. From detection to destruction, it was textbook reconnaissance strike integration. But within 3 weeks, COSVN was operational again from a new location. The command staff had relocated before the strike, taking their crucial personnel and communication equipment. The Americans had destroyed buildings and killed support troops, but COSVN itself survived. That's when I understood we couldn't win this war, Jerry Shriver confided to a fellow team leader. We could be perfect at our jobs, and we were. But perfect tactics can't overcome flawed strategy. We were fighting an enemy who'd been doing this for 20 years. They knew how to survive our best efforts. Statistical dominance, strategic irrelevance. By the time Project Delta stood down in 1970, its operational statistics were extraordinary. 450-plus reconnaissance missions conducted, 62 major enemy base complexes located and destroyed. Over 2,000 tactical airstrikes directed. Estimated 5,000-plus enemy casualties attributed to Delta-developed intelligence. American casualties, 42 killed in action, 118 wounded. The kill ratio, roughly 120.1, was among the highest of any American unit in Vietnam. Project Delta's intelligence contribution was invaluable. Multiple division commanders credited Delta Reconnaissance with preventing ambushes and revealing enemy dispositions that saved countless American lives. Yet none of it changed the war's trajectory. Despite Project Delta's effectiveness, despite their ability to locate and target enemy forces, the fundamental strategic reality remained. The North Vietnamese were willing to accept casualties and continue fighting, while American political will was collapsing. We were winning every tactical engagement and losing the strategic war, observed Master Sergeant Robert Howard, who earned the Medal of Honor for a Project Delta mission in 1968. You can't kill your way to victory against an enemy who sees the conflict as existential. They'd accept 10-to-1 casualties because they believed they'd eventually win. And they were right. The human cost. Beyond statistics, Project Delta's real story was human endurance pushed to its limits. The psychological stress of repeated reconnaissance missions, the constant threat of discovery, the knowledge that capture meant torture, the guilt of surviving when teammates died, created wounds that many veterans carried for decades. I did 3 tours with Delta, said Billy Waugh. I loved the work. I believed in the mission. But it cost me my first marriage, gave me nightmares for 20 years, and left me with survivor's guilt I still struggle with. Was it worth it? I don't know how to answer that. Jerry Shriver, who ran more Roadrunner missions than anyone else and was considered Project Delta's most effective operator, disappeared on April 24, 1969, during a mission in Laos. His body was never recovered. He'd survived scores of reconnaissance missions that should have killed him, only to vanish on one more patrol. His fate symbolized Project Delta itself, extraordinary capability ultimately consumed by an unwinnable conflict. The final missions. In late 1969 and early 1970, as American forces began withdrawing under Nixon's Vietnamization policy, Project Delta's missions took on a melancholic quality. Teams continued to locate enemy forces, but fewer resources existed to exploit the intelligence. Airstrikes became less frequent. Quick reaction forces were being drawn down. We'd find enemy positions, call them in, and be told, "No assets available," recalled Captain White. Or we'd develop perfect intelligence on a target and watch it remain untouched because the political decision had been made to disengage. That was harder than any combat. Knowing your work no longer mattered. Project Delta officially stood down in June 1970, though some personnel transferred to other special operations units that continued for another 2 years. The unit's records were classified. Most of its operations remained secret for decades. The men returned to a country that didn't understand or appreciate what they'd done. In the summer of 1988, nearly 20 years after Project Delta's last mission, a reunion brought together surviving members at Fort Bragg. Among them were Billy Waugh, Robert Howard, and dozens of others who'd operated in that shadowy space between conventional warfare and intelligence operations. They shared stories, remembered the dead, and grappled with a question that had haunted them for 2 decades. Had it meant anything? Project Delta's tactical legacy is undeniable. The unit pioneered long-range reconnaissance techniques that became doctrine for American special operations. The 75th Ranger Regiment's long-range surveillance units, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and Navy SEAL reconnaissance elements all drew from Project Delta's methods. When the Army established Delta Force in 1977, Charlie Beckwith, Project Delta's founder, designed it using lessons learned in Vietnam's jungles. Project Delta proved that small teams with superior training could accomplish what conventional forces couldn't, said Colonel Kingston. That understanding became foundational to how America fights today. But the strategic lesson is more troubling. Perfect tactical execution cannot compensate for strategic confusion. Project Delta succeeded at every mission while America lost the war. Their intelligence was accurate, their operations professionally executed, their courage beyond question. Yet none of it altered the fundamental political realities that determined the war's outcome. We proved you could find the enemy, hurt him, make him afraid in his own backyard, reflected Master Sergeant Howard. What we couldn't do was make our government want to win badly enough, or make the South Vietnamese government worth fighting for, or change the fact that North Vietnam saw reunification as non-negotiable. Perhaps Project Delta's truest legacy is as a cautionary tale. Military excellence, no matter how extraordinary, cannot substitute for political wisdom and achievable strategic objectives. The men of Project Delta did impossible things in impossible places. They deserved better than to have their sacrifice wasted on a war their country had already decided not to win. Today, in a small section of Fort Bragg's Special Warfare Museum, a plaque lists the names of Project Delta personnel killed in action. 42 names. 42 men who became ghosts in a war that needed them to be gods. They hunted where the bears lived. They did it better than anyone before or since. And in the end, it wasn't enough. That's the hardest truth of all.